All right, so today we're doing a deep dive into something I think a lot of us have some experience with, at least in some form, music festivals. Well, specifically what Nando Cruz calls macro festivals, these huge multi-day events that have become kind of a defining feature of the music scene these days.
Mhm.
And, thinking back to your own experiences at Reading Festival back in 1990, it really highlights how much things have changed.
It's remarkable, really. Back then, festivals were almost like these hidden gems, intimate gatherings for the truly dedicated, a far cry from the cultural behemoths we see today.
Right, like you really had to be in the know, word of mouth, trading tapes, that sort of thing.
Mm.
These days, festivals are big, big business. Just to give you an idea of the scale, in Spain alone, the number of festivals ballooned from 551 in 2005 to nearly 1,917 to be exact, just 14 years later.
And it's not just about the sheer numbers, right? The entire landscape of live music has shifted. Festivals have become the central stage, driving revenue and shaping how artists connect with fans in a way that, well, just wasn't the case before.
Absolutely. So let's dive into this whole idea of the growth machine, because one of the things that really struck me in Nando Cruz's book is this argument that bigger isn't always better when it comes to festivals. He talks about this growth spiral that's kind of come to define the macro festival scene.
It's a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it? As festivals grow, they need to attract bigger names, bigger acts, which obviously means bigger fees. And to cover those costs, ticket prices inevitably go up, which then means you need even larger crowds just to break even. It's a cycle.
And for the listener, for the person actually attending these festivals, this translates into a very specific experience, right? Packed venues, stages that feel miles apart, and this constant sense of FOMO because there are just too many acts, too many things happening at once to actually see everything you want.
It fundamentally changes the dynamic of experiencing live music. I mean, even someone like Tom York, the lead singer of Radiohead, has talked about this. He
Mhm.
described Glastonbury as having too many candies, which I think captures that feeling of, being completely overwhelmed, even oversaturated.
It's like trying to eat a whole buffet in one sitting. You end up feeling kind of sick. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about the financial side of things. Who's footing the bill for all of this? And more importantly, who's reaping the rewards? Where does the money go?
Well, it gets pretty complex. Artist fees, the money paid to those headlining acts, that's a huge piece of the puzzle. And it's a whole ecosystem in itself, influenced by everything from international booking agents to, frankly, a bit of cultural bias.
Yeah, the book talks about this double scale of prices, where you could have two DJs, say one local, one international, with a similar following. But the international DJ might command double the fee just because of, well, where they're from.
It's this perception that international acts somehow inherently carry more weight, more prestige, even if their music isn't objectively better. And that, of course, has ripple effects throughout the entire festival ecosystem, impacting everyone from local bands trying to get a foot in the door to the price you and I pay for a ticket.
Because those fees, they have to be recouped somehow. And then there's the whole world of corporate sponsors to consider, right? All those beer logos, those strategically placed banners, it's impossible to ignore.
Ah, yes, the art of subtly branding an experience. Sponsors are essential to keeping these massive events afloat, but their influence goes way beyond a logo on a banner, that's for sure.
Think about it. That beer you're drinking, maybe the layout of the festival grounds themselves, even what kind of food vendors are there, it's all part of a very carefully curated experience. There's a reason why you see certain brands over and over again at these festivals.
And it raises some interesting questions about what we as consumers are really buying into when we buy a ticket to a macro festival. Is it about the music? Is it that sense of community, of shared experience? Or are we maybe unwittingly just participating in one giant marketing campaign?
It's easy to get swept up in the excitement, the energy, the music. But it's also important to remember that behind all the spectacle, the lights, the music, there are real people working incredibly hard to make it all happen. And the book doesn't shy away from addressing the sometimes harsh realities faced by festival staff.
Absolutely. We're talking about the bartenders, the security guards, the stagehands, the folks working long, long hours, often for low wages and with very little job security. Their stories are often lost amidst all the celebration.
One story that really stayed with me was Letitia's. She was working as a bartender at a festival in Spain, and she bravely spoke out about the, frankly, exploitative working conditions she and her colleagues were subjected to.
It's a story that resonates because it's not unique, unfortunately. Letitia's experience speaks to a systemic problem within the festival industry, one that often gets overlooked or swept under the rug.
But her courage in speaking out, it sparked a conversation. brought attention to the issue of workers' rights and fair treatment within the festival context.
It's a good reminder that while festivals can be a source of joy, of community, of shared passion, we also need to be mindful of the human cost. It's about ensuring that everyone involved, from the headliners to the hardworking staff, are treated fairly and with respect.
And on that note, we have to talk about the environmental impact. We touched on the issue of waste earlier, but the book really digs deep, even going so far as to call out the greenwashing that often surrounds festivals' attempts at sustainability.
Right. There's a lot of talk about eco-friendly this and sustainable that, but the reality on the ground can be very different. The book uses the example of those reusable cups. The ones you pay a deposit for. Feel good about doing your part for the environment.
Oh, absolutely. We've all been there. You pay your deposit, you get your cup, but then actually getting that deposit back at the end of the night, it's like navigating an obstacle course.
Exactly. Long lines, limited windows for refunds, those tiny deposit amounts that hardly seem worth the effort. It's just easier to give up and toss the cup in the trash with everything else.
And according to the book, that might be part of the plan. In some cases, the real goal isn't actually reducing waste, but creating a new revenue stream from all those unclaimed deposits.
It's classic greenwashing, really. Using the language of sustainability to mask practices that are, at their core, still incredibly wasteful.
Yeah,
It really makes you question the motives, doesn't it?
it does. The book cites some pretty startling statistics about festival waste. Coachella, for example, reportedly produces something like 100 tons of waste. 100 tons every single day.
It's a sobering reminder of just how much of an environmental burden these events can place on the surrounding area. And it's not just the physical waste. Think about the carbon footprint associated with transporting hundreds of thousands of people, powering those massive stages, all the resources required to create these temporary cities of music.
It really makes you wonder, is it even possible for an event of that magnitude to be truly sustainable?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the book doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but it does encourage us to imagine a different approach. It introduces this idea of a fertile festival.
A fertile festival. Now that's an intriguing concept. Tell me more.
It's about shifting the focus from simply minimizing negative impact, from mere sustainability, to actually enriching the surrounding community and environment. A festival that leaves a positive footprint, both figuratively and literally.
Okay, I love it in theory, but what would that look like in practice?
Well, the book doesn't give a detailed blueprint, but it does offer some tantalizing possibilities. Imagine a festival that prioritizes local sourcing, using food and beverages produced locally. Imagine if they invested in renewable energy to power the stages and infrastructure.
Okay, I'm on board so far.
Yeah.
What else?
Think about it. A festival that actively partners with environmental organizations to implement robust waste reduction and recycling programs, one that fully engages with the local community. Showcase local artists, local businesses. That way, the benefits of the event extend far beyond the festival grounds.
So it's about creating a kind of reciprocal relationship where the festival and the community are both giving back, feeding each other in a positive, sustainable way.
Exactly. Now, whether such an idealistic vision can be fully realized within the context of a large-scale, for-profit festival remains to be seen, but it does, at the very least, provide a new framework for thinking about possibilities, for pushing the boundaries of what a music festival can be.
It's interesting. We've been talking about these macro festivals kind of in a bubble. They don't just exist in isolation, right? I mean, they have a real impact on the communities that host them.
Oh, absolutely. They can be like this sudden influx of people and energy. It's bound to have ripple effects.
Like imagine a small town suddenly having to accommodate thousands, even hundreds of thousands of extra people. It's got to be a bit of a shock to the system.
Yeah, the book actually uses a really interesting case study. It looks at the Spanish festival, FIB, and its relationship with the town of Benicassim, where it's held.
For those who might not be familiar, FIB is one of Spain's biggest music festivals. It's been running for like almost 3 decades now in Benicassim, which is this small coastal town. You'd think after all this time there'd be a pretty strong symbiotic relationship, right?
Well, on the surface, it seems like a win-win. The festival brings in tourists, creates jobs, puts Benicassim on the map. But as with most things, it's a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, the book even goes so far as to call the relationship parasitic at times, which is, well, it's a strong word. What does that even mean in this context?
I think what Cruz is getting at is this idea that The festival, while it certainly provides some economic benefits, it also consumes resources, disrupts daily life, and then, once the music's over, it packs up and leaves. The town is left to deal with the aftermath.
It's like having a house guest that throws a giant party and then leaves you with all the cleaning up. It's fun for a while, but
Exactly. And what about the people who actually live in Benicassim year-round? How do they feel about having this temporary city of music descend upon their town every year?
that's a good question.
And the book, to its credit, presents a range of perspectives. Some residents appreciate the economic boost, no doubt about that, but others feel like, and this is a quote from the book, the festival caters to outsiders, leaving residents feeling like strangers in their own town.
It's almost like it creates this weird divide, right? Like there's the festival reality, and then there's the reality of actually living in this place.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that even though Benicassim has hosted this huge, internationally renowned festival for decades, the book points out that its own local music scene hasn't really seen a parallel growth.
It's so interesting. It's like this huge influx of music and energy, but it doesn't necessarily translate into a sustainable local scene.
Right, and that gets at another important point the book makes, which is that these macrofestivals, while they're ostensibly about celebrating music, they can sometimes end up overshadowing, even stifling local talent.
Because all the focus, all the resources, everything is channeled into this one massive event.
Exactly, and then it's gone. So yeah, it's this interesting paradox.
It really is. Speaking of paradoxes, we were talking earlier about the environmental impact of these festivals. And, there's this big push towards sustainability these days, but the book really calls out some of the greenwashing that happens in the festival industry.
Yeah, it's easy to slap an eco-friendly label on something and call it a day. But often the reality is much different. Remember those reusable cups we talked about?
Oh yeah, those things.
Well, they've become kind of a symbol of festival sustainability, right? But the book argues that in many cases, they're not actually about reducing waste so much as creating a new revenue stream.
Oh, so?
Think about it. You pay a deposit for the cup, feeling all good about yourself, but then actually getting that deposit back at the end of the night. It's a whole thing. Long lines, inconvenient refund windows, and these tiny deposit amounts that, let's be honest, most people aren't going to bother chasing down.
It's true. It's like, what is this, 50 cents? Is it even worth it?
Exactly. So the cups just end up in the trash anyway, and the festival pockets the difference. It's a classic example of profiting off the illusion of sustainability.
It's kind of genius in a cynical kind of way.
Isn't it? And it highlights a bigger issue, which is that for many of these festivals, the bottom line still seems to trump environmental concerns. They'll pay lip service to sustainability, but when it comes down to it...
Profit wins out.
Exactly. And remember those statistics about festival waste? Coachella producing 100 tons of garbage a day? That's not an anomaly. That's kind of par for the course with these massive events. It's a sobering thought.
It's funny, we've talked about all these big macro things, economics, the environment, even the social dynamics of these festivals, but we haven't really talked about the music itself, at least not directly.
It's easy to forget about the heart of it all, isn't it? And it's not just that the music is what draws us to these festivals in the first place. What's fascinating is how the whole macrofestival phenomenon is actually shaping the sound of the music itself.
Yeah, the book talks about this idea of, and it's a great phrase, the sound of open spaces, to describe how bands are adapting their music to work in these massive outdoor settings.
It makes sense when you really think about it. I mean, you have these bands, many of whom came up playing in clubs, small venues, suddenly finding themselves in front of tens of thousands of people spread out across a massive field. It's a completely different animal, sonically speaking.
Right, it's not just about turning the volume up to 11. You have to actually think about how the sound is going to travel, how to fill that space without it just becoming this kind of sonic mush.
Precisely. It demands a very specific kind of approach, a different way of thinking about arranging music. You need something big, anthemic, something that can cut through the crowd and still pack an emotional punch.
And Cruz actually argues that this isn't just some happy accident. Bands are very deliberately adapting their sound to fit the macrofestival format.
Oh, absolutely. They have to be savvy, right? These festivals have become such a force in the music industry.
They're kind of unavoidable if you want to reach a certain level of success.
Exactly. And so you see these bands, even ones who made their name with a more nuanced, layered sound, adjusting their approach, embracing a more immediate, in-your-face aesthetic.
Which begs the question, does that come at a cost? I mean, does this kind of tailoring music for these massive events risk sacrificing creativity, originality, in favor of a more generic, festival sound?
That's the danger, isn't it? There's always a risk of homogenization when you have thousands of bands all competing for attention on these huge stages. The temptation to stick with what works, to go for those big familiar sounds, it's understandable.
And the listener, the average festival goer, might not even realize what they're missing, right? They just hear a wall of sound. And it sounds good, it sounds big, but they're not getting the full picture.
That's exactly right. And that's why I think it's so important to be an informed listener, to understand these dynamics, to realize that the version of a song you hear at a festival might be very different from what you'd experience in a smaller, more intimate setting, or even on a studio recording for that matter.
It's like seeing a movie on your phone versus seeing it in a movie theater. It's the same movie, technically, but the experience is totally different.
That's a great analogy. And in both cases, being aware of those nuances, those differences in format and presentation, can only enrich your appreciation of the art form itself.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the economic engine driving these macro festivals to their social and environmental impacts, and even the way they're shaping the music itself. So as we wrap up, is there one big takeaway, one big idea that you want to leave our listeners with?
After all this discussion, what really sticks with me is this. These festivals, for all their complexities and contradictions, they're really just a reflection of us, of our desires, our anxieties, our relationship with music, with community, with the world around us.
And like any reflection, they give us a chance to look at ourselves, to ask some hard questions. What do we value? Where do we fit in? What kind of world are we creating, both on and off the festival grounds?
Exactly. So the next time you find yourself at one of these events, take a moment to look around, really listen, not just to the music, but to the whole experience, and ask yourself, what does this tell me about myself? You might be surprised by what you discover.